Hey everyone, I'm Brett Scott. I'm the author of Cloud Money and the Heretic's Guide to Global Finance. And in this 7-part series, I'm going to take you from the ground level of our economy all the way through up to the highest levels of global corporate capitalism. This has been made in collaboration with Lankelly Chase. This is part 5 of 7. So, let's begin. So in the last episode, we looked at the components of a single corporation. We saw that the financial sector, which includes creditors and shareholders, will capitalize a corporate entity, which will be coordinated by managers, and which will blast money out to mobilize suppliers to input various assets and to mobilize workers to input labor, to in turn output products to consumers who will push money back into the circuit, which will go out in the form of taxes to government, bonuses to management, interest to creditors, and dividends to shareholders. A corporation, though, must always be seen as a subsystem within a much larger interdependent market economy. In fact, we can actually imagine the core of our economic system as a tangled web of these entities. So what we call corporate capitalism is the modern incarnation of capitalism, in which basically super large corporations all lock into each other and form the center of our system around which everything else orientates. They dominate over the productive forces of our society, dominate over the productive assets. So production in our economy is heavily concentrated in these massive players that span the globe. Now, almost every industry in the world is actually dominated by a small handful of firms, often no more than 10 to 20 of them, sometimes even less actually. But how do these titans actually get so big? Well, let's look at some of the factors that lead to them growing in scale and power. Asset accumulation. Capitalism is called capitalism for a reason. You're capitalizing on pre-existing power. The more money that a firm accumulates, the greater its ability to buy up new assets and command workers to then run those assets to build more stuff, which can then be used to make more money. Now, over time, this culminates in corporate domination over the means of production. For example, to survive nowadays, a small business must submit themselves to Google Maps and must tether themselves to Visa in the banking sector. To use our input-output language from the previous video, those mega firms have basically entrenched themselves as inputs to everybody else in the economy, thereby becoming a kind of inescapable infrastructure. Power over suppliers. Now, as mega firms accumulate assets, it increases their market power and their ability to dominate over their suppliers. For example, if there's one massive supermarket that dominates in a country, then a small salt producer that's trying to sell from their shelves can be forced to lower their cut of the final price. Basically, if you're thinking about a small salt producer as being a supplier to a big corporate who then outputs it to customers, the corporate can dominate over the supplier and force them to lower their prices, and then can take a bigger cut in the middle. This ability to dominate over suppliers is one reason why these big players can often outcompete smaller players, right? Because they can push down their input costs. That's why, for example, if you walk into a small corner store or something like that, you'll often notice that the prices are higher because they don't have this ability to dominate over their suppliers. Economies of scale. Now, economies of scale is a broad concept which refers to all the processes by which businesses gain advantages as they get bigger. But let's just look at one example. Let's look at the example of fixed assets. Now, a fixed asset is basically just a fancy term for something that can be used multiple times in the act of production. And most businesses will require certain fixed assets to compete. But some fixed assets only really make sense when used at a large scale. To use a very extreme example to illustrate this, imagine that you're a home baker who just makes bread for yourself at home. Now, it's going to be very, very expensive for you as a home baker to buy yourself a massive industrial dough mixing machine because it'll be massively underutilized relative to how much bread you're making. Whereas for a big commercial bakery, that input will seem less expensive relative to the amount of bread they're outputting. So this is one example of an economy of scale. In essence, bigger businesses will often experience their fixed assets as being cheaper. Mental capture. Now, large players can entrench themselves in our minds, basically because they have this constant presence all around us in our environment. For example, you walk into somebody's house, your friend's house, and you'll see the same brands of dishwashing soap or coffee or whatever it is, and their logos are going to be visible in every high street, and also their announcements are going to get freely reported on as front page news. Big players like Apple basically get free advertising, with newspapers running stories about their products. Imagine if you're a small business, there's no way in hell that the big papers are going to run any news stories about your announcements. Inertia harvesting. Now, economists are often convinced that choice is the defining feature of a market system. But in reality, many of our so-called choices in a market system are just inertia. What do I mean by this? Well, inertia is a process whereby something just drifts unless it's stopped. And actually, there are many of these types of processes in corporate capitalism. For example, a tired person walking home after work will just drift into the first supermarket that they see to grab the first box of cereal that happens to be on the shelf. Basically, the more presence that an entity has, the more of this drift it will capture. Now, in the UK, for example, supermarkets like Tesco's and Sainsbury's are like giant drag nets that capture money from the passing public. Lock-in. In the digital era, the longer that you use a platform, the less able you actually are to leave it. For example, you theoretically could choose to leave Spotify, but if it has accumulated a decade's worth of data on you and hosts all your playlists, the cost of leaving it is actually very high. Now, social media platforms like X actually now have this zombie-like feeling because large numbers of people actually want to leave them, but feel that they can't. Now, this lock-in is actually what Yanis Varoufakis calls Technofudalism. Symbiosis with states. Now, this is a huge topic, but basically, in very simplified terms, major firms can use their size to extract concessions from governments, or to direct governments in various ways, and alter regulations through lobbying, but also just through their cultural influence in general. You might have heard of the concept of the revolving door. This is basically the cycling of elites between industry and politics. For example, the former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair went off to consult for the massive bank JP Morgan, while the former Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg went to work for Meta, one of those giant techno-feudalist platforms. And obviously right now we can see this very blatantly in the case of all the billionaires who are hovering around US politics. Symbiosis with big finance. Now, this is also a huge topic, and we can only briefly touch upon it here. But basically, rich people can help other rich people become richer by contributing to the financing of their new projects in exchange for the cut of the future profits. Now, more generally, large players in our economy have priority access to the financial markets and can secure financing on much better terms than smaller players. Now, this boosts their ability to accumulate assets. Now, remember, if you want to become a central, entrenched player in the power structure of capitalism, you need to accumulate assets. And if you have high priority access to the financial markets, you can get the monetary credits to go and purchase or buy up assets, which can then, of course, kickstart that process for you. So you can feed upon your existing power to get more and more power. Now, we've been using this highly simplified representation of those interlocking parts of a single corporation. And as mentioned, the core of capitalism is made up of a tangled mass of these entities. But if we took all these corporations and companies and clustered their separate components into common categories, we'd see distinct sectors, markets, and classes of people. For example, as a class, creditors and shareholders are big players in the financial sector, and that zone between them and the corporate sector is called the financial markets. The zone between the different working classes in the corporation is called the job market. Suppliers will seek to sell into the B2B or business-to-business markets, while consumers operate in the consumer markets, which also get called the B2C or business-to-consumer markets. Now, in an earlier episode, we looked at how the market vortex forms. And at one level, that vortex is a single system. You can, however, also see the single market vortex as a series of sub-vortices in complex symbiosis. So by the time you're a small kid, you will have encountered all the various elements of this picture, but you probably won't have a very strong sense of how they interlock. Imagine taking a small toddler by the hand and leading them through a city. Now, their conception of the economy is going to be built from a whole mashup of disconnected fragments that they're going to see as they're navigating the environment around them. All of which will slowly condition their neural circuits, condition their brain, and their sense of what's normal. So, they're going to see strangers, people they don't know who are walking past them, drifting through stores, and they're going to see a whole lot of objects or commodities arranged on shelves, or for that matter on Amazon.com pages, or on the screen of their parents' phones. They'll see these little numbers with symbols next to them that accompany all these products. They will become aware of something called money, and it will appear to them as some kind of mysterious object that seems to have the power to command people to bring stuff to them or hand things over to them or turn up at their door with a package. They're going to see a whole lot of bright signs, logos, and brands that repeat themselves along high streets of cities. They'll learn that certain products are associated with certain named entities. They'll hear people around them speak about these entities as if they were conscious living beings. They're going to notice that these entities saturate our environment with a form of basically culturally acceptable chronic lying. These firms are always going to interrupt proceedings to make inauthentic and often irrelevant associations between non-market things like friendship, family, adventure, love, etc., and particular products. Our toddler will be very aware that their parents leave to go to work. And over time, they will realize that their parents do this to get the money required to get the goods from the strangers. They'll also be asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? And this will eventually turn at some point into an anxiety about this need to find a limited slot for themselves, a job, hidden somewhere in this confusing mass of strangers and products. They'll become aware that certain people do certain jobs, and that there's different status attached to these different jobs. They'll recognize broad classes of people who are split by their level of economic power. Now, high status is going to be associated with rich people, entrepreneurship, and luxury products. They'll notice that the richer people boss others who are more submissive. And those bosses are culturally favored, and the really, really big bosses have their faces on the pages of magazines, and will often get asked questions about the world on TV shows, for example, as if they were some kind of wise sage. Now, they'll also be told that these bosses built the companies that create jobs for all the submissive people. Now, our toddler will see many state institutions around them. So, for example, they might see the police driving past, patrolling the high streets to protect property. And over time, they're also going to form some awareness that their parents have periodic obligations to hand money over to the state. A confusion creeps in here for many people because having made an earlier association that goods come only after their parents earn money, they'll imagine that the state collects taxes so that it too can pay for things. Now, this metaphor of the state as some kind of large household will coexist uneasily alongside their awareness that, well, the money that they hand over to the state comes branded with symbols of state power. So they're going to experience this whole feeling of large-scale bureaucracy that's associated with states, but it's not only associated with states. It's actually also going to be associated more generally with the large-scale corporate sector. And in particular, it's going to really express itself in things like the financial sector. So our kid will experience this sense of alienating bureaucracy as they stand in line with their mother at a large bank, or watch their dad opening his account statement for his pension fund investments. The kid will form some distant sense that the financial sector is not only a realm of money, but also of abstract forms, numbers, and graphs. As if it was some kind of realm of physics or mathematics, rather than a realm of political human contracts. Now, our kid's brain will slowly cluster these fragments into discrete realms. each apparently with its own native logic. So for example, their parents are employees when they're at the office, but they're consumers when they're in a shop, or a taxpayer relative to the state, or a saver relative to the financial sector. Now, the vast majority of kids are not going to be taught to understand how these different parts interconnect with each other. In fact, if anything, they'll just pick up common mythologies and progress narratives about capitalism from the mainstream news, from school, from TV, and also from political speeches around them. And if they try to study economics in an attempt to learn more about this economic system, more often than not, the economics discipline will actively mislead them by presenting an economy as just a collection of independent Homo economicus agents trading commodities as if they were sort of floating atoms in space. So, in the next episode, we'll explore how we often end up confused and conflicted under corporate capitalism. See you next time.